Good morning, everyone. I'm Katina Pollack. I'm a faculty member here at the Faculty of Education. In a moment, Dean Schwain is going to introduce our two international guest speakers. I'm just going to do a little bit of house cleaning. I want to let you know that this session is being videotaped, and hopefully we will have it on our website so that those of you who leave and tell all your colleagues and friends how great it was, they'll have an opportunity to relive it. The panels will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will have a half hour for questions and answers, and Goli will be our moderator during that time. Because this is being videotaped, we ask that if you have a question, you wait till somebody either approaches you with a mic or come to this stand right here where this mic will be, because you'll see behind you we have a mic set up to the speaker, which is getting everybody's questions so that we just don't have answers recorded. Elan, if you want to just raise your hand there. Elan is our communications officer, and she is tweeting this session as it happens, which I'm not a tweeter or a Twitter or any of those things yet, but Kathy, you can follow it online because I know you're right in there.
What hashtag are we using?
Do you know what hashtag it is? Oh, she's coming up with one now, so we'll let you know momentarily. And I think that's all the housekeeping issues. Vince, we're okay? We're good? All right. Welcome. I'm so glad that you can make it in your busy lives and busy schedules, and I hope you find this a very informative and engaging session for the next hour and a half. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm glad you've given Katina a round of applause. She's just gone to a tremendous amount of work, and it's due to her passion and energy that we're able to bring this here today. So let's thank her again for just a great job. Rodney this morning said his background is one that you tell stories, and so is mine, Rodney. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story of why today is important for me. My son has a partner who is an amazingly strong, intelligent, and beautiful woman of color. And she has 3 children. Beautiful, precious little children, who in this country where we would expect there would be, we would be all embracing multiculturalism, experience covert and overt discrimination every day of their lives. And that's not acceptable. That is not acceptable to me, and I certainly know that it won't be acceptable to you. If, as Linda Darling-Hammond says, that schools and teachers secure the foundation for future civilizations has any truth, then quite clearly, in our classrooms, in our schools, we must create laboratories of practice where the mission and vision is to achieve a just and equitable society for all of us. So it's with that note that I have great pleasure to introduce you to speakers today who will no doubt stimulate in you the same passion that they have already stimulated in me this morning about changing things. We, after the meeting today, just brief meeting this morning, already realized we have dramatic changes to make to our teacher education program. And I've listened very carefully to the suggestions that they've given. Whoa, Rodney, there went your tin. Anyway, allow me to introduce you to our 2 speakers. Dr. Christine Sleeter, would you stand for a moment just so that they don't confuse you with Rodney?
No.
Christine Sleeter is Professor Emerita in the College of Professional Studies at California State University, Monterey Bay, where she was a founding faculty member. Formerly a high school learning disabilities teacher in Seattle, she previously served as a faculty member at Ripon College in Wisconsin and at the University of Wisconsin Parkside. And she's been a visiting professor at a number of different universities, including Victoria University in New Zealand, San Jose State University, San Francisco State University, Washington State University. She is currently president of the National Association for Multicultural Education and previously served as vice president of Division K of the American Educational Research Association. Her research focuses on anti-racist multicultural education and teacher education, and currently she is developing a new area, critical family history. So please join me in welcoming Christina to our ranks. Rodney. We'll have you just stand up so that the people in the back can see you. Dr. Rodney Hopson. Rodney Hopson is a professor in the Department of Educational Foundations and Leadership in the School of Education and faculty member in the Center for Interpretive and Qualitative Research at Duquesne University. He received his PhD from the Curry School of Education, University of Virginia, and has done postdoctoral sabbatical studies in the Faculty of Education, University of I did it again.
Namibia.
Namibia. I know I can say it and it keeps coming out.
It's fine.
The Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and the Center of African Studies, Cambridge University. Hopkins' research interests lie in social politics and policies, foundations of education, sociolinguistics, ethnography, and evaluation. Relative to his varied research interests, Hopson raises questions that, one, analyze and address the differential impact of education and schooling on marginalized and underrepresented groups in the United States, Southern Africa, and other nation states that attempt to come to terms with democracy, social change, and equity. And two, seek solutions to social and educational conditions in the form of alternative paradigms, epistemologies, and methods for the way the oppressed and marginalized succeed in global societies. I've had a look at not just these dossiers, but also their tremendous publications, and we must feel very, very privileged today to have with us such distinguished scholars. So welcome very much, Christine and Roger.
I'm actually going to stand and use the, yeah.
We are giving each speakers about 30 minutes, and then we have plenty of time for dialogue discussion.
Yeah, we were having conversations earlier about whether to present from a seated position or a standing position, and I can actually see you better from a standing position. So that's what I do. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about learning to teach and then preparing teachers to teach in culturally and linguistically diverse settings. This is maybe slightly different from the topic on that you were given, but not too terribly much different. And I want to start with some personal storytelling. And I'm going to work sort of through myself learning to teach, and then a little bit about what I learned as a teacher educator, and then a little bit about a professional development project that I've had quite a bit of involvement with. I grew up, I'm white, and that's relevant to all of this. And I grew up in Southern Oregon in a pretty much all white community. And a question that I come back to a lot of times is, how did a white person get involved in multicultural and urban teaching? And what did I learn along the way that might have made a difference? When I kind of fell into teaching, partly because the program that I went on was based in Seattle, which was more interesting than where I was living at the time. Not a good reason to go into urban education, but you know, sometimes life is that way. And I found myself in a inner city high school teaching world history. In the school as well as in my classroom, there was no racial ethnic majority. It was a very diverse student population, and most of the students were from more or less working class backgrounds. I was on a kind of field-based program where I was in the school for a period of about 8 months. And I remember spending time, as one does, as a beginning field experience student first, of simply getting to know the kids and going around and helping them with their work. This was a history class, and my cooperating teacher's way of teaching was to lecture for about 25 or 30 minutes, and he was a good, fairly engaging lecturer. And then kids would read the chapter and answer the questions at the end of the chapter. And I remember helping the students answer the questions at the end of the chapter. And the process that they usually used was to read the question, go back through the text, find a sentence that answered the question, write that down, and then go on to the next question. And I was thinking, wow, you know, this isn't exactly thinking deeply about history. And then I spent quite a bit of time outside of the classroom and outside of school getting to know just the kids as kids. So the day came for me to have my first solo teaching. The topic was feudalism in Europe. Again, now this was world history. And so I spent a lot of time getting my lecture together with the idea that I would replicate what my cooperating teacher was doing. So I came in with my lecture notes, really, really nervous, and started doing my lecture. My cooperating teacher thought, okay, things seem to be going well, so he left. Big mistake on his part. And about 2 minutes into my lecture, I looked out at the students and saw their eyes glazing over. And I thought, this is probably the view that he has every day. And if this is what teaching is, I can't do it. So I put the lecture notes down, and I started asking the students, these are 10th grade students, what do you want to learn? What's interesting to you? And I think that they had probably never had a teacher ask them that question before. So at first I started getting all kinds of answers. But they converged on, okay, time, this is about 1972. They converged on wanting to know about women's liberation because the women's movement was very visible just out in the streets, out in the communities. And there were a lot of things they didn't know about it. So I thought, okay, women's liberation. What would you like to learn about women's liberation? So we started doing some brainstorming. What I later learned was developing a webbing on the board. How would you like to learn about women's liberation? And so we came up with what I didn't know at the time was cooperative learning groups. And each one of the groups then developed some investigation methodology that they could use to learn about their topic. My cooperating teacher, then it was the end of the hour, he came back in. We'd gone from feudalism in Europe to women's liberation. He graciously allowed me to take the rest of the week to play this out. What I learned from that week was when students who had previously been pretty academically disengaged have an opportunity to have input and say into what and how they're learning, their engagement goes way up. The students, it wasn't the best unit that was ever taught in the world because in a lot of ways I was trying to figure it out for myself. But the students' level of engagement, their interest, their taking their topics and running with them was much higher than I saw during the rest of the time of my student teaching. So that was an important lesson that grounded me of co-constructing what happens in the classroom with your students and starting with getting to know your students and developing conversations with your students. A second important learning for me, which was taking place roughly around the same time, was my learning about race in the context of the African American community. I had a number of friends that I developed both while student teaching and then after I got a job teaching in the inner city. A number of friends who were African American, including a guy I was seeing for about 4 years. And I lived in a black and white neighborhood that was close to the central area of Seattle that was largely African American. The school that I was assigned to teach in was a white desegregated school, and many of the African American students who were bused into that school came from my neighborhood. So I then spent about a 4-year period really being kind of culturally and racially decentered in a way of spending quality time with African American adults who very gently and persistently gave me one of the most profound re-educations I've ever had in my life. I usually, when I'm around people, I spend a lot of time listening. So I spent a lot of time just listening to people unpack their day, both their days in schools as well as in the other walks of life that people were in. And I learned a tremendous amount about how racism works in the United States, as well as a tremendous amount about the culture and resilience of the African American community. I remember, for instance, this being again the early 1970s, thinking that the civil rights movement, naive me growing up in an all-white community, thinking that the civil rights movement had pretty much taken care of racial issues. And then talking with one of my friends who was trying to find a place to live and had a lesson on racial housing segregation and how that works. And it kind of blew me away because what I was learning was just a different narrative about how the US works than the narrative I grew up with. Over a period of time, this extended community-based immersed learning changed both me as well as later would have a big influence on how I think about preparing teachers. So to do a little bit of fast forwarding, when I became a teacher educator, the biggest piece, I think, that I built into the courses that I taught was community-based learning. And I kept trying to think, how can I create for teacher education students, most of whom, when I was in Wisconsin, were white, the kind of learning that I had, which was community-based, and how can I package that in a way and put it into a teacher preparation program. So for a number of years, I was telling the group earlier, the state of Wisconsin had a requirement that in teacher education, folks were supposed to spend 50 hours working with people who are of a background different from theirs. And in most teacher education programs, that took place in school. And while teachers need to learn in schools, teachers also need to learn in communities. Because in school, you see kids reacting to what's being given to them. And I would remember back to my student teaching of the glazed expressions and the boredom and the copying the answers out of the, and thinking, if that's the only exposure that I get to kids, there's a whole lot that is missing. And I can come away having learned stereotypes about the kids rather than having really learned the context in which kids come from. So I spent, and I could sort of go on and on at length about this, but I won't, but spent several years as a teacher educator working with community-based organizations to set up practicum placements for my teacher education students, and then developing ways for them to learn how to learn from and with the communities that they were in, and then to begin to translate what they were learning into things that were pedagogically relevant in the classroom. And this had a profound effect on a lot of the students. I remember, for instance, one young man who was scared to go into the African American community. And I'm thinking, if you're scared to go there, how can you teach there? And I thought I was going to have to pick him up by his collar and take him, but he finally went on his own. And in this particular instance, he was contributing his computer skills to an organization that I knew fairly well, and I knew the people there, and they needed somebody to help with some of their networking issues. And he realized through the experience, he said the biggest thing he had learned is he thought when he went that the reason why African American kids weren't doing a whole lot in technology was that it must be something about African American culture that wasn't technology oriented. But what he learned was that it had a lot more to do with lack of access to technology, that the African American community, the schools, the neighborhood organizations couldn't afford the technology that he was used to seeing, and that people were, people really wanted to learn the technology, and that it was an access issue, not a cultural issue. Many more stories I could tell. I won't, but what I found later when I went to review the research on preparing teachers for culturally and linguistically diverse students, preparing teachers for urban schools, that the program component that probably has the most promise for substantially starting to shift how people think is community-based learning. In most teacher education programs, that's not a part of what we do, but that may be the part that has the most power to start changing teachers, to start thinking in terms of being responsive to and responsible to the communities in which they're working and the kids whom they're working with. Okay, a little bit more fast forwarding. Where are my time? 10 more minutes. 20. Oh, okay, good. Okay. Okay, a little bit more fast forwarding to California, because there I learned something else about teacher preparation. Well, sort of when I moved to California in 1995 as the founding faculty member for California State University, Monterey Bay, the main role that I ended up taking on was to direct the Master of Arts in Education program. And in that context, now California, the demographics are quite different from they were in Wisconsin. Monterey County, where I live now, has the highest proportion of Latino students of any county in the U.S., or yeah, probably the U.S., any county in California. Not the highest number, but the highest proportion. The university, though, is also situated next to what used to be Fort Ord Military Base, which was one of the first of 2 military bases to desegregate. So it has a very, very diverse population. So the students we get at Cal State Monterey Bay are very diverse. There is no racial ethnic majority, and are mostly from working class backgrounds. So in that context, a group of very diverse faculty members and I decided to create a master's program that embodied everything we knew about multicultural social justice, bilingual education, and worked to create a program that had several features to it. One is that the California states are kind of positioned relative to the other universities in California in a way kind of like a streaming system or a tracking system, where it's sort of like we're the lower track. The University of Californias are more of an upper track, and they get a richer funding formula. And then the Stanfords and some of those private elites are kind of the honors track. And so the California states that have the much more diverse working class student populations are in some ways sort of like the lower track. So we started thinking, how can we make our program as intellectually powerful as the private elites, like the Stanfords? How can we make sure that teachers and other graduate students going through our program come out as well prepared for wherever they want to go, whether it's staying in the classroom, becoming teacher leaders, or going on to doctoral institutions, as somebody who would be coming out of a place like Stanford? So that was kind of one part of multicultural teaching, which I think is critically important, is giving students access to the academically rich environments that the more elite students have. But a second thing we wanted to figure out is how can we do this using knowledge frameworks that come out of African American studies, Chicano studies, indigenous studies, feminist studies, working class studies, so that we have a rich multicultural curriculum that grounds what we're doing. We also tried to figure out how can we build our pedagogy in a way that builds on the knowledge that our students bring, and that helps our students who are from diverse backgrounds to be able to have intelligent conversations that go into depth about issues related to racism, to various forms of oppression, to identity, to privilege. How can we do that? And I could lay out course models and all of this, which I won't, just sort of don't have time to do. But the faculty, we spent a lot of time doing collaborative work among ourselves, just trying to hash out how to construct a program that would do these kinds of things. And I think actually we figured out how to do it very, very well. But as a professional development model, this was another time when light bulbs started going on. I mentioned that we had a diverse group of mostly classroom teachers going through the program, but there are also other folks, some people in community education and adult education, early childhood education, who are also part of the students going through the program. But I wanted to follow some of the teachers into the classroom to see how they were teaching and what impact some of, I was teaching a class, for instance, in multicultural curriculum design, and had them design a unit, so I wanted to see what happened when they implemented it. So I followed several of the teachers into the classroom. And this other aha moment happened when I saw the teachers begin to implement not just what they'd done in my unit, but start to construct their classrooms like we had our master's program constructed. So teachers were starting to engage their students in critical conversations around social justice and equity issues, and telling us that they'd learned how to do that from watching how we facilitated conversations with them. Teachers started having their students give sophisticated presentations and become activists writing letters to the school board, and some of this because that's what we had modeled with them. Teachers were developing much richer multicultural curricula and co-constructing some of it with their students because that's what we had modeled with them. And what it led me to realize is that maybe one of the most powerful forms of teacher professional development for working with culturally and linguistically diverse learners is when the teachers themselves are diverse and are being taught and facilitated in a way that models the kind of teaching that that would, we'd like to see happening out in the schools. Okay, I'm going to fast forward here to a third project that all relates kind of back to the idea of engaging with students and learning how to learn from students and community. And this is some work that I've been doing in New Zealand. Actually, the particular project I was working on is now completed. But I was doing work in different capacities with a program in New Zealand called Te Kotaitanga. Te Kotaitanga is a Maori-based school reform project that was initiated when some Maori educators started trying to get a handle on what's happening with Maori students in the school, the indigenous students of New Zealand, and why are so many of them leaving school, particularly around the 9th and 10th grades. There are a lot of key places where students leave school, but 9th and 10th grades was a big one. And students, even when they stayed in school, grade points were low, they were disproportionately high disciplinary actions, Maori students disproportionately high in special education. And so the leader of this particular project, Russell Bishop, got some money from the Ministry of Education to kind of look into the situation and did what he calls a scoping exercise where he and some colleagues collected narratives of experience. And the way the narratives worked is they went into 2 secondary schools, and this was a Maori research team, and asked Maori students to tell them what's working and what isn't working for you. Essentially, I mean, they broke it out into more questions, but that was the big thing they wanted to get at, is how do Maori students understand their experiences in school and why so many students leave school. They also then asked the teachers the same questions of tell us, why Maori students aren't doing very well in school. They asked the parents, the Maori word whānau, the extended kind of community, to tell them their stories, and they asked the administrators to tell them their stories. And in going back then and analyzing and coding the data, found some real interesting patterns. One of probably the most biggest pattern was that the kids talked about what they would like to see happening in the classroom and what they would like to see the teachers doing with them. The kids talked about things like saying, well, our teachers they don't know us, they don't care about us, they don't teach us. if we don't understand something, they just kind of look at us and go on to the next topic. They oftentimes don't even physically get close to us. We're kind of sometimes seated, you know, off in the back somewhere. When we're out on the playground or, you know, out in the halls, if something happens, we're the ones that get blamed, regardless if we did anything or not. They find little things to pick on us. For instance, Maori students, Maori people, a lot of them wear greenstone that's usually a gift given by somebody in the family. And sometimes that was taken away from them because they're, you know, oh, you shouldn't be bringing that stuff in the classroom. When the teachers were interviewed, their narratives were very different. They talked about, well, these kids come from homes that don't really value education. The kids aren't very academically oriented. They don't try very hard. They don't seem to come into the class with a background. They just kind of leave school. They ditch their classes. They act out, or blah, blah, blah. So the kids were wanting to see something different in terms of their relationships with the teachers and instruction. The teachers were kind of blaming the kids. The parents' narratives were very much like the kids, and the administrators' narratives were kind of somewhere in the middle. The team decided to do a couple of things with these. One of the things was to take the Maori students' descriptions of what they would like to see happening in the classroom and develop what they called an effective teaching profile, and then build a professional development program that would help teachers learn to implement that professional development profile, and I'll get to that in a minute. The other thing they did was to write up these narratives in the form of what's now a book, and use it in the professional development program. So the way the professional development program goes is it'll start off with a school deciding that they're going to commit to being in this project. And when they do, then they'll take the teachers in groups of 30 per year. And somebody in the school will get appointed as a facilitator. So this takes some money, which initially has come from the Ministry of Education, but the schools then are supposed to learn how to work with their budget so that they can pick up the cost. The facilitator then becomes kind of the leader of the professional development. The teachers are taken initially for a 3-day session on the marae, which is a Maori term for basically Maori space. And for many of the non-Maori teachers, it's their first time of being kind of culturally in a different place where it's somebody else's space, not their space. And that in and of itself for 3 days is kind of this experience that makes them think. But then they start by having the teachers read the narratives of experience. And that is hugely impactful on the teachers. I've talked to a whole lot of teachers who they see themselves in the narratives, and they see their students in the narratives, and they're saying, oh my God, if this is what they're saying about me, because I can see where I've been thinking and saying the things that the teachers are saying. For some of them, their resistance kind of breaks down immediately, and they break down and crying and stuff. Others, it takes a little bit longer. But as a tool for getting past teacher defensiveness, that's turned out to be immensely helpful. Then for the rest of the professional development project, the main way it works is then the facilitators go into the teachers' classrooms and have a data collection sheet that is based around the effective teaching profile. So they look at things like the extent to which the teacher is physically positioning him or herself close to the Maori students, the extent to which the teacher is interacting with the Maori students. And the whole professional development is really predicated on the idea of helping teachers get to know their students, develop relationships with their students, And then through those relationships, learn how to co-construct pedagogy in the classroom, kind of like what I was figuring out as a student teacher. The facilitators, then they go into the teachers' classrooms about once a month, and then after the observation, they sit down with the teacher and have a collaborative, co-constructed conversation using the data that they've recorded, so that both parties can then kind of make sense out of the data and see, you know, how was I doing this time in terms of positioning myself so that I'm having conversations with my students. How are we doing in terms of monitoring student work and actually helping, you know, giving students feedback on their work? How was I doing in terms of figuring out ways of incorporating Maori culture into the classroom and Maori language into the classroom? These conversations have proven immensely helpful for the teachers because okay, this is into my role now. I was part of a evaluation team that went to evaluate the project. And so we went into most of the schools in the project, sat in something like 300 classrooms. There was a team of us. I didn't sit in 300 classrooms, but sat in about 300 classrooms, interviewed somewhere around 150 or 200 teachers, as well as interviewing kids to collect data on, is this process making a difference in classrooms that actually affects kids? That was the essential question we went after. So what did we find out? The teachers love having somebody in the classroom help them. Overwhelmingly, the teachers, once they got past the fear of being observed and the kind of scariness of going onto the marae and, you know, the emotional impact of reading sort of about themselves in ways that in many ways kind of made them kind of like feel sort of terrible about what they were doing. Once they got past that, they loved having people come in and actually help them pedagogically. What did we find in terms of them changing their practice? Well, we found actually a rather substantial shift in pedagogy in the classrooms. Before the project, there was something like about half the teachers not implementing the effective teaching profile at all, and maybe 5% of the teachers intuitively already doing a good job with all their students. After 2 years in the project, almost half the teachers became real good implementers of the effective teaching profile, and only a quarter of the teachers weren't. So there was quite a substantial shift across the subject areas. And remember, this is secondary school, and so that was really good to see. We also found about a quarter of the teachers who didn't make a shift in their pedagogy, probably because it looked like their teaching skills were so bad that trying to help them learn to teach diverse students, it's like there were bigger issues there, like just basic classroom organization, basic classroom management, basic, and that also kind of flagged to me that sometimes when we're trying to improve teacher professional practice for diverse learners, for many teachers, there are some prior questions just about even, you know, being able to develop a lesson plan. When we interviewed the Maori students, we found a huge impact of the project. We compared interviews with the students before, you know, from the original narratives of experience, and then interviewed students in all of the schools, and also did the research in a way in which it was Maori researchers interviewing the Maori students. Because in one case, for instance, when I was the only researcher there, the kids just sort of looked at me like, who are you? And then when Wally Penatito walked in, and then I kind of faded in the background, then they kind of started talking. But the students really, really resonated with the changes teachers were making, and talked, it was huge, about the value to them of the teachers spending the time getting to know them and then using what they were learning to try to improve instruction for them. That was huge for the students. And as a result, student retention started going way up. Not just among the Maori students, but actually among all the students, because it turned out that as the teachers were getting better at teaching the indigenous students who had been least well served by the schools, they were getting better at teaching the other students as well. So we found student retention, actually a huge difference in student retention as a result of the project. On achievement, in some areas, good impact, in other areas, not so much. And part of this has to do with the fact that this was a 9th and 10th grade project, and in New Zealand, you get student achievement data in 11th and 12th grades. We're not sure if the 11th and 12th grade teachers are doing the same kind of teaching as they were learning in 9th and 10th grade. But we also could see across the schools involved in the project that a substantially higher proportion of students were leaving school university ready. And that include both Maori students as well as non-Maori students. So from all of that, what I was able to do was to have some time experiencing and helping to evaluate a professional development project that it was systematic. It was based on the idea of replacing deficit theorizing about kids with a relationship-based approach to teaching and learning. And through a relationship-based approach of professional development and a school-based, in-classroom-based approach to helping teachers learn to teach the kids they have. And that with the investment in time and resources, it is making a difference. And it's making a positive difference both and particularly for the Indigenous students, but also for the students at large the teachers have. And I think making teaching something that for the teachers, they're simply enjoying a lot more because there's more success going around. So I'll stop there.
We're just trying to get the, can you get the, yeah.
Well, let me, while things are warming up, I'm not going to sing a tune. I've seen them do that. I've loved the way they, kind of set themselves up, but I'm not going to be singing. It won't go down well here. You see, someone say, "Never know." Again, I'm going to just start with a vote of thanks. Dean Vicky, I don't know if she's still here. Associate Dean Goley. Prof. Katina Pollock for the for just being gracious hosts over the last several months, and then leading up to today. What I'll do is start with a quote, and the quote is from one of my heroes, Frantz Fanon, and in the context of his work that he did in one book called Wretched of the Earth, he was primarily speaking about groups of Africans worldwide that had come in contact with the debilitating effects of colonialization, racism, and otherness. But I use it for also thinking about my challenge for working with my students who happen to be predominantly white. And his quote goes something like, each generation out of relative obscurity must define itself, its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And I think it's as important for my current students who happen to be predominantly white, that they fulfill their mission as they work in communities that sometimes don't look like them. I'm going to do a bit of, you know, when we get into the university business, we can't think about anything but in threes, and it happens to be around teaching, research, and service, right? It's like I can't talk to my kids about their own work without saying, well, how, are you teaching, are you researching, and are you doing service? But it's just a framework for how I'll present this work as well. And so a bit of background just suggests that the work that I'm going to share with you is a bit of service work. And if you know, in the faculty business, we don't get credit for service work. And so one of the challenges that we have to do is rethink how we make our service publishable, and we use it in the context of our teaching, right? Just as much as Boyer was talking about scholarship of teaching, we've got to think about scholarship of service. And so I'm going to share with you a bit about a partnership that's been developed over the last 4 or 5 years, lessons learned, and then ways that I try to engage my undergraduate and doctoral students. And then this work is in some ways contributing to a larger book with another colleague on issues of neighborhoods and cities and inequality, specifically in Rust Belt cities in the United States. And those are the Detroits, the Pittsburghs, the St. Louis's, the Rochesters, the Buffaloes, the Clevelands, the Baltimores, and so forth. What I'll do maybe first is share the website. Is it still up? Yeah. For those in the back, maybe you can't read it, but it's on our Duquesne University website, and it says the Hazelwood Partnership is an ad hoc group, working group of community and university stakeholders that seeks to equip the residents of Hazelwood to become the community they desire. This is done by building and sustaining a relationship between Hazelwood and Duquesne University based in mutuality and reciprocity. I think it's a good way to start. Because the way that I see the work that I'm doing is both contributing to communities and also building labs of practice, as I heard your dean speak, in ways that contribute to these communities. What's important, as I'll talk about my lessons learned, are that we rethink the relationships between universities and communities. Because of the inherent power differential that exists between them, it's important for us to rethink. So as you heard the description of the partnership, it speaks about the communities and what they wish to be. Not what we wish to see them as labs of practice, not what we wish to see them as purveyors of our knowledge, not the ways in which we want to utilize their space, but in ways in which they become what they would like them to be, right? And that's an important transformational linguistic shift in how we think about our communities as well. And in fact, I would say as well, is that I don't teach classrooms anymore without some service learning component. I've learned that even if it gets the SL, service learning designation that we have at our university, or not, doesn't matter. I need to take my students, whatever the classes that I'm teaching, into the community. I need them to wrestle with the theory and the practice. And so, in teaching ethics, it's important for them to know not about just thinking about Kant's categorical imperative, but also doing it, right? It's important for them as they think about Rawlsian social justice, not only thinking about social justice, but doing social justice. Again, from the traditions that I'm from, we go to church regularly. And so we have adages about church. And one of them is, as it relates to this theory and practice issue, that I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. And so this notion of theory and practice is an important one in terms of making sure that we involve a nice seamless description about how we do theory and how we do practice. And so even when I don't get the service learning designation, I think it's important that I take my kids to the community. So here are my lessons learned, and I'll start with these and then try to embed some of what I've learned through my presentation, and I'll walk through these slides. Promise there's not very many, but I'll scroll through a bunch of them. Lesson number one is that service learning in urban education requires critical, contextual, cultural understandings of communities. Number two, that community action participatory research at the university requires rethinking community-university relations. And three, that community action participatory research is best done with eager students who want a grade. Yeah, okay, good. And realize that their grade matters, and particularly in exposing a hidden curriculum, and that's an important part of it. And I'll come back to that as well. So lesson one is understanding Pittsburgh means understanding Hazelwood. I won't go into a lot of depth on this, but the scholarship part of the work around Rust Belt cities in the context of the United States suggests that the phenomenon of urban promise and neglect in the United States is a massive issue, right? You can just go to some of your neighboring cities in the US. I don't know Canadian cities well, but just to see a massive amount of urban blight that transforms into the communities and schools in which we live. Understanding the Steel City, Pittsburgh, means understanding that we're both livable on some major indicators of quality of life, but also unlivable for larger segments of our population, which happens to be a common metaphor amongst many US cities who are struggling in this Rust Belt phenomenon as well. Understanding Greater Hazelwood is important because my students, when I get them involved, if Hazelwood is our place of work, it means understanding that it's not far. Hazelwood is not far. It's actually in Pittsburgh proper, but my students say they don't stop there. They go through it. They're coming from the west. They come through Hazelwood, but they don't stop in Hazelwood. That for me is phenomenal. They don't stop to get petrol. They don't stop to get a cool drink. They just go through it. And as I learn more about my students, I realize that what they're hearing is things that they're hearing from their folks. Don't stop in Hazelwood. Don't park in Hazelwood. Don't go to Hazelwood. So when they have a teacher who says our service will be in Hazelwood, I get things not from my kids. I get things from their parents who are my age, who say, or who communicate to their kids, I don't want you. And I have these lovely students who, 18 and 19-year-olds, who say, my parent is having problems with us doing work in Hazelwood. For me, it's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. And I say, well, you know, it's great. All I have to do is put the G word out there, and they figure out a way to talk to their parents. Now, I actually don't know really whether their parents are the ones saying it. I just know there's something hidden around how they think about the history of the places in which they go to. And I think it's important to expose those issues. When they hear grade, 30% service, they go, I'll work with them. I go, good. You do that. Or do you need me to call them? Because I'll be happy to communicate with them. No, I'll work with them. These kind of conversations. So it's 3 to 4 miles from Pittsburgh. And if you know Pittsburgh, you know we're the city of rivers. We're the place where the Ohio River meets the Monongahela and the Allegheny. A tremendous population of what was formerly native communities, First Nations as we call them here, but have been exterminated and extinct, moved. But those words, Monongahela, Allegheny, Ohio, those are not European words. And so part of the understanding of the place that we're from is understanding and giving honor to the place that we live. So we live in this place. And so Hazelwood is 2 of 93 recognized distinct neighborhoods that are contiguous to some other more wealthy places, but also near those places. The most interesting fact that I didn't put on this is that in the 10 years, the 5 years that the 3 or 4 years that I've been working there, the most important, maybe arguably the most important the note here is that in the last 12 years, 2 schools have closed, one elementary school and one high-performing middle school. And so when you go to the neighborhood, you've got school buildings that are closed, right? And so we'll maybe come back to that issue as well. So lesson 1 means understanding Pittsburgh means understanding Hazelwood. My kids don't understand the places that they live. And it's important for us to get a critical understanding about the places in which we live, the places that are a neighborhood to us. And so what I'll take you through briefly are some of the indicators that I think are important as I frame the place that we'll be going. And so we're one of the most livable by virtue of indicators you see here around low unemployment, low crime, income growth, cost of living, artistic and cultural opportunities that I won't bore you with, but I would say that Pittsburgh has a distinct reality of being a place at the turn of the 19th and 20th century that was that had the largest population of millionaires in the east end of Pittsburgh. There's a great book called The World's Richest Millionaires or something, and it was written about 70 years ago, but it was focusing on the Carnegies, the Mellons, and the Hineses, right? Who grew up in East End part of Pittsburgh. Carnegie Mellon University, the ketchup we use for our French fries, and right? The Fig Newtons that we eat, right? Nabisco and so forth. Those were the populations that lived in that East End, right? But as we know from Saskia Sassen, who writes on the sociology of globalization, Steel City is also a harbinger of post-industrial, of our post-industrial country that's witnessing deeper systemic transformations and expulsions. The expulsions she refers to are the diversity of conditions, growing numbers of abjectly poor, displaced folk, informal refugees, minorities and persecuted, warehoused in prisons and so forth. And so in the Steel City, we have the distinct honor of being the most livable and the most segregated in our largely metropolitan indices in the United States. That's a phenomenal record, quite frankly, but one that we often don't recognize, and I know my students don't as well. And so what I'll take you through are pictures and some graphs just to illustrate what we see here. When we moved to Pittsburgh in the late 90s, we were told that there were 60 days of sunlight a year. Well, we don't have 60 days of sunlight a year. But what they remembered, and if you've flown through or been to Pittsburgh anywhere between or around before the 80s, this is the image you remember. So on a day like today, you see clouds, but that was soot. That was the soot from the steel. Those were from the steel, from the coal industry that neighbored the city, but also endemic to the city. We're the Steel City. We're what the America has built itself on. Now, we don't do steel anymore as well as we used to, and nor do we do it as cheaply as those in the Far East do. But we're known as the bedrock of industry and steel in the United States. So you remember this, but now you see this. From this to this. And so this is, for us, a very, very clear day. But this is the image, the golden triangle, which meets the Monongahela on this side, the Allegheny on that side, and near the point is the Ohio River and where they meet. But this is a new Pittsburgh and a changing Pittsburgh. And I can talk more without going into detail about some of the socioeconomic shifts from steel to service that we've been witnessing in the last 40 to 50 years. So the reality is that our Steel City is unlivable for a large group of excluded. And these are the realities, both the racial demographics in Pittsburgh as harbinger of other post-industrial cities. We see a very low quality of life for African Americans. The issue of high school attainment and role of schools as being decreasingly important for certain populations, particularly in the public sphere, unemployment rates and burgeoning populations, and issues, pandemic around African American families, communities, and schools that we can compare to anyone around the nation. This is the Pittsburgh that I live in. So when we situate Hazelwood as the place that I'm encouraging my students to go to, I think it's important for them to get an image of the place where we work. They already have a tacit understanding of what this image, what this means and what this image is all about. Because remember, their parents or their uncles and their aunties are already saying, don't go to Hazelwood. And so I'm going to share with you very briefly, and I'll just take you through just to situate where Hazelwood is, but also I'm going to run through these slides, and I'm not going to go through all of these. But here's Hazelwood, 15207, 0 zip code, and a contiguous neighborhood, which is the greater Hazelwood. And poverty, right? And so you notice that in the dark shades of green in these neighborhoods, those people living in poverty. Notice the contiguous neighborhood and the reasons why, my interpretation, why they don't want to bus their kids into this neighborhood, but why these kids should be going to this neighborhood. Housing values, notice housing values, 0 to 32, 0 to 32. And Hazelwood, no data. Believe me, it's somewhere between 0 to 32. These are the neighborhoods that we're going in. Median household income, notice light green shade, 20 to 31,000. Notice Hazelwood, 0 to 20. Greater Hazelwood. These are the places we're going. Population change. So again, one of the things that we were told in Pittsburgh when we first moved there 12 or 13 years ago is that it also had the second largest elderly population in the United States. How is that possible? Well, they say right behind Dade County. I'm going, Dade County, okay, that's the place where folk want to go to. But what we realized about Pittsburgh is that this is where people did not leave. So you got Dade County where they want to go to in Florida, but and then there's Arizona, but these are the places where they didn't leave. So notice population change, single head of household data, single parent households, dark shades, 35 to 90, depending upon the shade. And so part of the lesson for us is, yeah, we're only 3 miles away from this community, but we're going to be working in these communities. Hey, you should see the deer glazed looks on the faces when we wind up in those communities on the first or second day of class. They're a bit like you. I mean, just staring, wondering what's going to happen. Why are we here? What does this have to do with social justice? What does this have to do with ethics? And so part of this is putting them into these spaces. Let's go together. And so part of what I do as my own critical pedagogue is also create safe spaces for them. One, we have to talk about these things, and we've got to go together. It's not enough for me to say, go to those places and then tell me about them when you come back. They need to know that Hopson's going to be on the same bus, in the same car, going with them to those places. Because I already know there's going to be some fear. I already know there's going to be some apprehension and some anxiety, even though we might be sitting in a church. And so I'm always anticipating some of these issues as well. Lesson number 2, that our universities have to do a much better job of encouraging and engaging our youth, our learners to be citizens, able to be courageous citizens to address issues that are important to what they live. We've got to do a better job of also connecting to those citizens, connecting to those learners in those spaces, right? It's not just about whether I have the iPad 2 or whether I know how to tweet, right, at one level, but it's also how do I understand the role of social media in their lives? How can I make sure that social media is a relevant activity for them and contribute to? So when a colleague says last night at dinner that I had them create a wiki, of course, they know wiki, this is their language. They're wiki language, right? Social media language. For us not to engage and to utilize those tools is also taking us back to a place back in the 50s and 60s when those things didn't exist, right? That's not where they're living. And so it's important for us as we think about our roles of universities to think about how do we prepare citizens for democratic participation. I'm going to skip through some of these slides as well, just because of the interest of time. I think I have about 7 or 8 minutes. Okay. And if I know your associate dean in the time that I've known her the way maybe you do, I know she's a stickler for these issues, and so I'll be brief. And so we have a lot to do about understanding the role that universities play, both in terms of the way that they think about the way we think about democratic realignment, the way we think about the importance of social responsibility, the way we think about changing institutional cultures and institutions that we work. I'm taking this work from a white paper in democratic civic engagement that Saltmarsh and other colleagues put together based on some work that has been going on for several years, couple decades, that have been thinking about the role that universities plays, both in the work that Vince and all have done in Dewey's Dream, a great book reading, but also the Saltmarsh. I'd be happy to share those issues as well, those references as well. But you notice that some of the key questions they raise are questions that I think we ought to be thinking about as we think about engaging our communities in which our students will be teaching in. And those are things like, well, how do universities cultivate caring and democratic citizenry? How do we ensure that our efforts transform higher education? What sort of commitments are needed to take place in the work that we do? And so findings from a colloquium not so long ago are providing things that we already know, that universities are not in line with civic engagement, for example, that we tend to sidestep the political dimension of the work that we do. Universities as political engines, how about that one? As corporate political engines, not just in places that you transform and you go to get a degree, but as political engines in communities where we live. And that some of our dominant epistemology in universities has nothing to do with the practice and lives in which these kids work on a day-to-day basis. And that's horrific for me. And so I'm being challenged by this work, but also thinking about developing citizens and students who are responsive to communities. And I do that in thinking about lesson 3 and my final lesson in terms of exposing this hidden curriculum as a major part of learning urban education. And I won't go to all these things, but I'll just say that part of what it begins with is a series of conversations that I have with community people who are invested in their community. And that just begins with, what do you need? How can we help? You know, not what are your epistemological issues and social concerns that focus on your particular neighborhood, right? Right? What do you need? How can we be of service, right? And so what happens is, before long, I realized that my students are preferring to be in those communities. They don't want to be in these relatively narrow buildings in which we teach that have nothing on the walls at the university. They would rather be there. They'd rather be out there and about trying to learn who these communities are. And so they prefer to have class in the community. And they also want to be challenged in terms of living their democratic realities, not just checking the boxes at the very end of class in terms of whether I taught well and so forth, but they want to be engaged. I won't take you to all the examples, but I'll end on the note that I too think there's a hidden curriculum, and that one of the things that I think is important for me to do is to expose this hidden curriculum for my predominantly white provincial students who face a different reality than their grandparents, their grandpas and their grandmas. And I do this by making sure that the texts they read, the conversations that we talk about are fundamental to the things that we'll be doing. I encourage them to walk around with books like Lies My Teacher Told Me, not just for their own reading, but also to realize that these are conversation starters. Why do all the black kids sit together in the cafeteria and all the conversations about race? I need them to walk with these books, quite frankly. I don't even care if they read them. I need them to walk them. So one says, why are you reading that book? Why are you reading that book by Gary Howard? Why are you reading that book by Sonia Nieto? What's the title of that book? Just for them to get a conversation. Then they might read a little bit more and kind of answer those questions, but just to realize that these books are also conversation starters. And they force our students to think a bit more deeply about the work that they'll be doing. And so part of what I need my students to do is embrace and engage courageously and to help to contribute to these mechanisms of change in ways that will benefit them and the communities they serve. Great.
Caroline, I have in fact a question for each of you. For Christine, I was wondering if in New Zealand, for the Maui population, have they thought on expanding that program to other grades so that other teachers benefit from what the 9 and 10 grade are doing? And for you, Mr. Rodney, I was wondering if they had if you're doing or part of your program is following those students after they leave your class to know what's their benefit, what's the impact of getting into that community after they leave your class, or if there's just a one-time part of when they're with you, or if that keeps on changing them and helping them. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. We've had conversations about expanding the program into the primary grades, but actually there have been conversations about various ways that the project can be expanded. Currently, it's expanded to work more with school leaders because the project itself focused on professional development for teachers in the classroom, but not so much on the leadership support that needed to be in place for the work to actually be sustained and kind of flow through the school. Like, for instance, a lot of the school leaders hadn't been paying attention to who was being streamed into what levels. And so there's now a big offshoot of the program. Offshoot's probably not the right word, but that's focused on leadership training. There's also been conversations about expanding it into pre-service teacher education. And the problems that they're running into there is that most of the pre-service programs think that they're already doing a good job of preparing teachers for the schools. And so getting teacher education to own that they might be doing a good job of preparing teachers for mainstream white students from middle class, professional class backgrounds, but not necessarily for everybody else, is taking on that ownership is kind of a huge issue. But it hasn't gone into primary schools yet. I think not for necessarily a good reason. It's just that keeping all of those pieces going right now is a huge task in and of itself.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. The short answer is no, but I write plenty of letters of recommendation, which students want. It's an idea that came up at the Monday night presentation at OISE as well, and I've been thinking, how would that happen? How might I go about doing that? How might I monitor? How might I track? You know, so I'm giving some thought, and the more questions I get, and the more challenging questions I get about it, the more likely I'll do it. It's a new curriculum, and so those students at their fourth year would be required to provide some portfolio presentation, and so those students are in their third year now, and so I tend to be one of the faculty who observe and ask questions of the graduating fourth year portfolio students, and maybe I could put something together, but if you got some ideas, we could talk about it.
Hey, thank you both so much. Those are awesome presentations. I loved hearing about the work that you're doing. And I have a question for Rodney, actually, because I'm curious. You get these students coming to Hazelwood community, and they're not stopping on their way through before and all of that. How do you get them to not totally freak out when they get there, and sort of get them gently immersed and aware of it?
No, it's a very, very, very good question. This is a bit how I felt with my Thames Valley colleagues this morning, actually, is that, you've been prepping for a meeting, you've been, reading things about them, and you don't want to come off as, who are you, and what am I reading? I don't want to come across, I want to try to gentle into a set of conversations about meeting people, right? We all have different traditions of how we meet people, right? How do we graciously take people into communities? And because of the nature of my own research work, both comparative as well as cross-cultural, in the context domestically in the United States, but outside, I know it's important how we enter communities, and to use Sarah Delamont's work, it's also important how we leave communities, right? We talk a lot about research access, like going in, but we don't do very much about the methods for leaving communities, right? And so we usually start out, where are you? We usually start out with a tour, and in the tour, we might stop at a restaurant and get a cool drink, right? Because if they haven't stopped there, then they don't know the assets that exist in the community. They don't know that you can even buy a drink that might be cheaper than the one they're getting across town. You know, so, no, I mean, you know, so kind of gently, but leaving the community probably is the most important, quite frankly. It's not the easing in that I really worry about. It's really thinking about how do I leave, right? How do they leave? Because I don't leave, right? I make it clear that I'll be a purveyor of the information. I've made myself available to the community to say, you might see some students come and go, but you'll see me come and go. You'll see me come, stay and go and come back, right? And so I need to ensure that my presence is there continual. And so what we tend to do is we need to leave something, right? In the process of identifying some problem of practice, right? Some inquiry-based issue that will focus on something that is of need to them, we've got to make a presentation to them as we leave, right? We've got to say, this is what we felt, this is what we saw, and thank you so much for letting us come in, right? And that is not typically how we think in our kind of fast-paced living. Maybe if I could say, maybe I'm a bit off on this, but kind of the Euro way of thinking about entering and leaving communities. But in the African ways of thinking and indigenous ways of thinking in communities, we leave things for our people, right? And we give things to them, you know. And so those kind of things.
Hi, I'd like to add my thanks to you both as well for coming here today and for keeping alive the discourse of progressive education, social justice work, equity, critical pedagogy. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing that you're doing. As a white woman, I find myself working with First Nations communities and having, you know, I could so identify with what Christine said, and having professors, colleagues, professors, say to me, but aren't you scared to go out there? And to do the kind of work that Rodney talked about in First Nations communities, which is very comparable to the kind of work that you do in Hazelwood. I guess what I want to talk about or ask about is the other side of our discourse. Because I don't know how it feels in the United States, but in Canada it feels like we're fighting a losing battle. And so the discourse of neoliberalism, of new managerialism, of a particular kind of politics faces us every day. And teachers who are trying to do the kind of work that we would all think is important work, the kind of work I was able to do when I was a teacher in the late 60s and 70s, the kind of community engagement I could have with the women's movement and with other social justice movements, feels so difficult now, I think, for teachers to do, and in fact for professors of education to do. And it's that kind of the constant political struggle and the resistance and the trying to teach the exercise of agency that seems to me now to be a new challenge for us, a challenge that we hadn't faced in the past, but which is with us every moment of every day now as we are forced into standardization and testing regimes and so on and so forth. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you confront and deal with that in your work.
Yeah. I can very much resonate with what you're saying. As you were talking, I was thinking about a young man in my multicultural curriculum design course, for instance, who was saying, I'm learning a lot here, but I can't do in my classroom what I'm learning because I'm a second-year teacher and they won't keep me if I do. And that's like, I don't have, all I can say is ways in which I've tried to wrestle with it. But I don't have, here's a solution to it, because it's huge. One of the ways that I've tried to wrestle with it is to find classroom teachers who are doing the kind of collaborative, multicultural, engaged pedagogy, kind of in spite of the mandates and in spite of the standards, and then having them talk about or write about what they're doing and how they're doing it. I just finished co-editing a book, for instance, with a colleague from Buffalo, where we had some teachers write about their practice, and specifically in this neoliberal standards-based context, and write 4 new teachers to help new teachers understand how experienced teachers have been grappling with these kinds of issues to be able to enact pedagogy in their classroom. Because I think it's really critically important to keep a vision alive of what teaching can be. I encourage teachers to join activist networks, and we do have in the States a growing collaborative now of teacher activist groups that are fighting back and speaking back. In San Francisco, a group called Teachers for Social Justice, Rethinking Schools is part of it. There are teacher activist groups in several places around the country that have now come together into a network that's called the Teacher Activist Groups, and they have a website and they put on conferences, but it becomes a way of teachers collectively speaking back. And they have study groups within these organizations in which they're reading Paulo Freire and reading, reading critical pedagogy and multicultural social justice work and working on that in their own classrooms. They tend to be very culturally and linguistically diverse groups of teachers. So part of the move to push back also comes from outrage over what's happening with kids in schools. Yeah, but those are, for me, the main ways of trying to confront what's happening. Sometimes it's easy, and I'll sometimes hear people say, well, there's nothing I can do, so this is what we're asked to do, so this is what I do. But we need to speak back and fight back. Oh, the other thing, too, that I've been doing some writing about is looking at the impact of the kind of engaged teaching and learning that we've been talking about on student learning. Because when curriculum is culturally relevant to the kids, when pedagogy is culturally relevant to the kids, when the teachers are culturally relevant to the kids actually perform better. And having data on the positive impact of multicultural social justice teaching on kids also becomes at least another piece of the arsenal to be able to speak back.
You know, it's profound. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Because what I see is, or what I hear is, I hear a war-torn veteran of the struggle who's out there and who is tired, right? And in our, okay, good. I'm just telling you what I.
I'll go with my grade fighting.
Yeah, great. But part of the, part of the narrative that I was hearing was, it can be tiring, it can be challenging, right? And while you will go to your grade fighting, this is what, right? We see, and I hear a colleague who's been out there fighting for as long as some of us are alive, quite frankly. And so I don't mean to, I hope it's appropriate for me to rely on some of my own traditions and how I think about these issues as well, but also to encourage, right? And then to try to build solidarity as well, because as much as the Freirean notions that speak to solidarity, that speak to hope, that speak to dialogue, that speak to faith, I mean, those are the things that we do get tired, quite frankly. We get tired of hearing some of that bull bureaucratic speak, neoliberalism and neoconservatism speak that talks about how we ought to be teaching, how our kids ought to be learning, and we do get tired of hearing that. And so I have to, like you more likely, have to resort to songs. We have to resort to songs of struggle, right? Poems of struggle. Even hope may seem but futile when with troubles you're beset, but remember you are facing just what other men have met, right? Poem by Edgar Guest, See It Through. I rely on things like the story that Mordecai told his daughter Ruth in the 4th chapter of Ruth, where he said to her that if you don't rise up and challenge that dictator or that overthrower or your husband, as he was, that change will happen from some other place, but it's at a time as this, right, that needs to happen, right? I have to rely on those things. I have to get strength from those things and also share those things. And then lastly, I'll refer back to one of my own theologians and innovators of speech. When I get a little bit weary, and it's the Godfather of Soul, who had a song called Deal With It. So James Brown had a song called Deal With It. And so, you know, he might not be a theologian for you, but he is for me in terms of his lyrics. And so part of the things that we draw on are these same issues as well, right? We deal with it. We realize that in spite of it, we'll still see it through, and that we'll rely on those that we read, the Freires and others that really provide a bit of hope to us to think about those issues. And so I think part of that is I hope I'm connecting with you on these issues.
We could have very interesting discussion.
The articles that we read to prepare for this morning, what really resonated with me was the conversation, Rodney, about race versus culture, which for FNY populations especially, like I had connected it with race being like in Canada having to show a status card to show that you're Native, whereas like culture is more the power to self-identify, which is what we promote in our schools. The slides that you were showing were interesting because you're like, you know, we connect, you know, low achievement scores like that, you know, students who are from minority groups are struggling to connect with school, resulting in lower achievement scores. We connected that with poverty and oftentimes what happens, and I know this is what happens, you know, in a lot of First Nations communities, is that poverty becomes part of the culture, such that when you finally connect with these students and you encourage them to do well in school and then you encourage them to go to university, you start seeing this conflict. And that's, I mentioned this morning about my thesis about this inner conflict where you find yourself disconnecting from what you think is your culture and this fear of like, if I go to university, am I losing who I am? So I think that's something that I see a lot of, like I know it's something I struggle with personally. It's something that I see students in this area, especially from the local First Nations community, struggle with. If I go away to university, if I do well in school, they've connected their cultural identity so much with the other aspects of the cultural poverty that they feel that if they do that, they're disconnecting themselves from who they are. And this is very, very prevalent, especially with First Nations communities where the legacy of residential schooling is such that there's that level of mistrust that still exists. I mean, we have students in our schools right now who are being raised by grandparents who actually attended the local residential school in Chippewa, which was right in the middle of the reserves. So it's something that students are really still connected with, and that fear of that connection with their own like culture, like being First Nations and the culture of poverty and being able to separate that
and that shift that we want to see. We want to see more FNMI students go on to be in academia in different professions. So I don't know if it's something you've ever struggled with, Rodney, or you see students struggling with in your practice.
Yeah, do you want to tackle that? Because that's something that is relevant to your paper too.
Well, I can, but you can also.
Go for it. Yeah, go for it. I have something else.
Okay. Yeah, I think each of us will. Yeah, who wants to? In my university work in California, with students who are from Chicano Latino backgrounds, whose parents have been migrant field workers, and many of the students who have immigrated to the U.S. from poor backgrounds in Mexico, but particularly second, third generation students whose parents have been field workers wrestle with that a lot. And we get in our classrooms students who aren't sure if going to university, I mean, the distance that they're feeling that they're separating from their families is huge. And what, both on my campus as well as community college folks that I've worked with in a doctoral course who have struggled with this, what's emerged as being something that's at least really helpful is mentors at the university who are from the same background as the students, who have kind of walked in the same shoes and can help students envision themselves as scholars who don't have to give up who they are, but are adding layers to their identities, but not having to leave their identities. And at least in what I've seen in my experience in California, even though out-group members can help with that, sometimes the strongest helps have been in-group members who have been wrestling with those very same issues themselves. But with many of our students, what you're saying is just huge.
Yeah, you got me thinking about some work in Southern Africa, but what I would say is, at the outset, is that I think we tend to over define what schooling is without a real understanding of what education is, right? So we don't distinguish education and schooling, which is problematic, because schooling might exist in this wall, in these four-walled, curricular-focused, standardized, so forth and so on, but education extends beyond these four walls. And that's an important distinction. That's an important distinction to make. But it reminds me of a situation among, in Namibia, is a group of people, you probably know them as Bushmen, because of the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy. But they're the most marginalized indigenous group in the context of Southern Africa. And so they sit in Namibia, and a large group of them, the Junkma, are located in Namibia. And over the last 10 to 12, 15 years, a series of schools have been built to provide more support at a primary school level that gives support to their language and culture in schools as they transform and they move from their village schools to the government schools at grade 4, 5, 6, middle school, high school, and so forth. There are some significant challenges when they leave their village and they go to the community or the larger growth area that the school doesn't recognize as important quite yet, right? What I want to do is I don't want to put the emphasis on these learners who have to only deal with the challenge of identity, but we should be putting as much weight on these schools and these systems as well that welcome these schools, these students as well. And so this even in the context of in this country, while those learners have been matriculating for years, they drop out in massive numbers. The more they matriculate through middle up to high school, the more they drop out. And the dropout is tremendous, because many of them drop out from grade 4 and they'll walk back home 40 kilometers in massive numbers. You talk about, walking with your feet, protesting with your feet. They'll leave school at grade 4 and walk 40 miles with groups of 30 or 40 of them back to their villages. And so schools are not as, right? It's not that just our identities are also bifurcated or trifurcated in these spaces, but schools don't do a good job of welcoming us and understanding the realities of the identities that we actually have, right? They don't recognize that the materials that are shared are important. They don't understand that our elders ought to be brought into our classrooms, right? And so I don't want to beat us up who have to deal with these multiple dual consciousnesses, if I'm using Du Bois in terms of double consciousness and this two-ness, to understand that we have this kind of multiple narratives and realities, but schools ought to recognize that as well. Why aren't those teachers reading Du Bois? Why aren't those teachers reading those issues? Why aren't those teachers bringing in those people in those communities to say they're important purveyors of the culture in those communities? And so not just us, my dear, but also those schools and those systems as well ought to be more welcoming to us.
Well, on that note, we would like to thank you on behalf of our community here. Thank you so much, Christine and Rodney, for coming here. And I think that Katina has some presents for you.
That's got to be shipped. It's got to be shipped.
I make sure
It's got to be shipped.
I make sure you can pack it.
My sweetie, thank you so much.